The reason everybody's watching today, I think, or the biggest reason would be because tomorrow the NCAA will release its list of 10 teams in each region that are under consideration for the playoffs. They will not list a ranking of 1 to 10. They will simply be in alphabetical order. But we are going to do our best along using the great work of Inkblot Sports. Um, he's been an incredible resource for us in the past, and he's doing it again this year only on his own website and with his own Twitter handle. And we'll encourage you to follow him and visit his site. But nonetheless, he's done some work, and we're going to interpret some of the raw numbers that he has on the site. We'll also look at how he has them ranked and where we might differ in our opinion. We'll start with Super Region 1. And in Super Region 1, you see that Ashland would be the team that would receive a bye if the playoffs were to start next week. But Chuck, what are your initial thoughts, kind of an overview of Super Region 1 as you see them being displayed?
Yeah, so let's take just like a minute or so and kind of level set some really high level. I think
Okay.
most people watching have probably been through a playoff cycle or two with D2 and with us and have a pretty good lay of the land and what this is all about. But we can kind of give the 30,000-foot level of what this is and why it's important. So these regional rankings are what will ultimately determine our playoff field a couple weeks down the road. Our playoff bracket is made up of 28 teams, and there will be 7 teams from each super region that make that tournament. So we are selecting the teams regionally. So when we talk about regional rankings, that's why this is so important. Like these are the rankings that are going to determine who makes the playoffs. So typically what the committees will do is release rankings 1 through 10 with the understanding that it's the top 7 in that bracket
Right.
that would actually make the postseason, but they're going to give us 1 through 10. This is the first year that this initial release of the rankings will not stack rank 1 to 10. They're just going to tell us these are the 10 teams, and they're just going to give them to us in alphabetical order. So now starting next week, after next week's games, then they'll do the conventional 1 to 10, and then we'll have the playoff reveal on November 13th. So that's why this is so important. That's why we spend so much time talking about these regional rankings. They are very different from the national opinion polls. Like a lot of us are voters in the D2Football.com poll. That's more like the college football playoff that we hear talked about in the FBS level, where we can kind of use whatever metrics and whatever analysis we want to use to determine our top 25. We can do that. With the regional rankings, there's a set list of criteria that they use, and it's very mathematical to determine things like your strength of schedule. There's some room for analysis. There is some room for discussion and debate, but it's mostly a mathematical process. So that's where it's very different from the national opinion polls that we do. And if you are new to this, it is confusing. It does take a couple of years to kind of get adjusted to it. We have some info. I've got a whole column on the website on d2football.com where we kind of lay out the basics if you're new to this. So with all that kind of said and understood, we're going to kind of go through each of these regions. So Super Region 1, if we did start the playoffs now, we'd be looking at Ashland as the number 1 seed. Followed by Shepherd, IUP, Slippery Rock, New Haven, Notre Dame, and Assumption would potentially be our field today. Now, again, this is snapshot point in time stuff. This does not mean that if Ashland wins their next 3 games, that they will be the number 1 seed. In fact, I think that they won't be. I think if Shepherd or IUP wins out, I think it's very possible, probably more so Shepherd and maybe not so much IUP. But I think it's very possible that if Shepherd or IUP win out and win the PSAC championship, and I do believe that the winner of that game will be undefeated, I think there's a very good chance that team will jump Ashland and go to number 1 in that region. So it's very important that we understand that just because this is how it looks today, even if we play out with those teams winning out, it doesn't mean that there won't be movement along the way. And there's also some really big games yet to be played that are going to impact this bracket. I think the biggest game that's out there in the Northeast 10 is New Haven and Assumption is actually this coming weekend. So you can see you got 2 teams that are in the running. They're playing each other this coming weekend. That's very likely or very possibly going to be a playoff and elimination game. So that's a big one in the Northeast 10. And actually, I think probably the biggest game that's still out there is going to be Slippery Rock and Kutztown in the last week of the regular season. They are scheduled to play each other. That could change if one or the other was in the PSAC championship game, but I don't think that's going to happen. So That's a big one that's still out there to be played as well. So a lot of things could still cause some movement. And really what can cause that is how your strength of schedule can change. Your strength of schedule is on a weighted scale of your opponent's winning percentage and your opponent's winning percentage. So it's basically who you've played and who all of your opponents have played. And then they combine that onto a weighted scale to determine your strength of schedule. Now that column that we have highlighted in the middle, I don't know if we have a title for that, Brandon, but essentially what that is it's the combined value of your D2 winning percentage and your strength of schedule. So we've actually listed the teams, and as we go through the rest of the super regions, that's how we have them ordered by that
because
value.
That's how Inkblot had ordered them, or we sorted by that metric from his website.
Yeah, and I think it's very possible that you could see results very much like this when the committee gives us 1 to 10 rankings next week. But that your win-loss record against Division II and your strength of schedule are really the most important factors in these rankings. But other things that they will look at, your record against teams that are over 500. So we can see we've got a couple of teams there that are 3-0 against teams that are over 500. That can carry a lot of weight, especially if you're really close in your strength of schedule and your winning percentage. And then the performance indicator, I'll table that and let some other guys who know a little bit more about that speak to it. We hear conflicting information, to be perfectly transparent. We hear some conflicting information from different people around the country about how much that may or may not be used.
Chuck,
but it is a tool that's available to them.
Chuck, I think a reason that we hear the conflicting information is that super regions can vary in how they apply the criteria, as long as it's consistent. So one super region may use it and another may not, but as long as it's applied fairly, they're allowed to do that. That is my understanding. I could be wrong, probably am, but
and that's also why we have a national committee to apply some oversight to make sure that we're not completely all over the map and how that criteria is applied. So when we see the rankings tomorrow for Super Region 1, they'll be listed alphabetically. They won't be stack ranked like this, but this is kind of how we would envision it if we were getting 1 to 10 rankings starting this week. And again, it could look entirely different when we do the same exercise next week.
Great. So did you have anything else to add to that, Chuck?
Well, one thing that I think is really important to understand is head-to-head competition carries a lot of weight where it can be applied. But that can be really tricky because it can't be everything. For example, there are some head-to-head results that you see here. Now, I know that we don't have these necessarily completely stack ranked 1 to 10. If it was, I would definitely have Bentley ahead of Assumption because we have a head-to-head record there. The Bentley beat Assumption, so you've got a head-to-head result there. Now, you've also got Assumption defeated Kutztown. So Assumption would be ahead of Kutztown. So I'd actually have Kutztown behind both of those Northeast 10 teams. So head-to-head's really interesting. Keep that in mind when we start looking at Super Region 4 because there's a whole cluster of head-to-head results already involved in that region. So I think it'll be really good to weave that back into the conversation at that point.
Well, and the interesting point with that too, Chuck, is that's one of those criteria too, where there's not an inherent math to be used for it. So it's how do the committees want to do it? And the explanations that I've always kind of heard over the years is that it really only comes into play if those two teams end up directly next to each other.
That's my experience as well.
In the sequencing, right? So if they are separated by 2 spots, that may not come into play. The committee may not even bother to choose to use it.
Right. And how much does a head-to-head result offset? If you've got a 1-loss team and a 2-loss team, but the 2-loss team has head-to-head, are we going to value that head-to-head result over the better record or not? And there's definitely times we've seen that go both ways.
Sure.
Yep. So does anybody else have anything, you guys see anything else that we might need to add about the Super Region? Or general, what are your thoughts?
I just want to throw out there, so the Mountain East, right? The Mountain East has 3 teams that are 6-2, and the one that's left out is Wheeling in this particular ranking. So I'd be kind of curious to know, what may be the difference there.
Very low SOS.
Yeah. And I think it's good to kind of put that out there as the reason why they're not on this list as a 6-2 team.
Sure. I mean, there's obviously a cutoff somewhere, and it's harder, Chris, it's harder when there are fewer games because, there are less, head-to-head competition. Your strength of schedule could be way low, way high. And, obviously we're cutting off somewhere, but that would be one reason. Do you know specifically what that is, Matt?
Yeah, actually, well, I'm taking a look at it right now in terms of if we look at it, because obviously we've got a list of 10 here, and for you, Brandon, you're trying to put what is the list of 10 essentially that they would have on Monday. Gannon right now, Wheeling, and Frostburg State are kind of the next three in line per se. And if I look at Wheeling, they have a strength of schedule of 435, which is kind of ouch low, to be honest.
Right.
However, if I'm not mistaken, Chuck Wheeling's got a big game this week that could help vault them into the lower portion of this conversation. Isn't that correct?
They do still have some games coming up that could help put them into that position. And
they play Concord this week.
Yeah, so Concord's got a team with a good record. And by the way, Wheeling is a team that's really only in their third season of fielding a football program. So it's pretty awesome for them that they're even on the periphery of this conversation.
Though, I think Ferg does bring up an interesting point, though, is while keep in mind, guys, as Chuck alluded to earlier, every time we look at this page, it's a snapshot in time. So next week, when we look at this, I'm not going to be worried about what was on the page here.
Correct.
I'm looking at what do we look like a resume through 9 weeks.
Right.
And it's almost like a way to reset our heads, because these are not standings. This is not someone needs to jump someone else. Right. This is a new way to look at teams every week, because based upon who you play, your strength of schedule could go up or down measurably. If you play a really good team, that's going to give you a bump in strength of schedule. If you play a team that's over, you're going to go down quite a bit. So there's quite a bit, like when the Ferg talks about Wheeling, who's probably about 12th right now, with a win, they could vault into this conversation because of that week-to-week changing.
Yeah, and I'll add in, it's not even just like what your strength schedule is your opponents as well. If your opponents have a slide for a week where you had two good teams on there and they both lose, it could hurt your strength schedule as well. So there's many factors that kind of go in each week for that.
All right. All right. Anything else about Super Region 1? Okay.
Nope.
All right. Let's go ahead and it'll take me a second to share. I will bring up the same thing for Super Region 2. Okay. And if the playoffs were to start this week, Delta State at 7-0 would receive the bye. And there you see the remaining teams. So, Chris, what are your initial thoughts on Super Region 2?
Well, unlike Super Region 1, Super Region 2 doesn't have any two-loss teams here because there's so many of them that the way the schedule has played out so far, they've been able to make it so far without that second loss. One of the things I just want to point out to start is the undefeated teams. And you kind of see how, Virginia Union's strength of schedule is far behind Delta and Benedict. And I think Benedict has really, benefited from playing Fort Valley, who's a one-loss team, Albany State, who's a one-loss team in division, amongst their Division II games. They've got that out the way. Whereas Virginia Union has some pretty stout games coming up. They've got a over 500 Chowan this week to settle the North Championship in the CIAA. And then they've got Virginia State, who's likely going to be an over 500 team. And if they're able to get past Chowan, then the championship game, which is likely going to, at this rate, going to be Fayetteville State again. So they've got those three games out there, whereas Benedict's got an issue because they've got some pretty poor teams left. They played a Morehouse that's definitely an anchor, and they've got two other anchors in Clark Atlanta and Allen coming up that's really going to hurt their strength of schedule before they get to the championship game. And I think they're hoping that Tuskegee is going to be that contender from the West, because I think that's really going to help their strength of schedule, as you see at the bottom. Inkblot's deal, the way he has this set up, Lenore Ryan's number 9 instead of Tuskegee here. And, again, I think some of that's got to do with strength of schedule. I do also want to point out here that, there's some really big games that are left to be played beyond championship games in Super Region 2. So, Delta State's got to play West Georgia, who's a 2-loss team. And then Wingate has got Lenore Ryan coming up. They've got Newberry coming up, and so those are some really big games. Fort Valley and Albany State have to meet 2 weeks from now. So that's another big game. And really, the South Atlantic has a lot of games that they got to play. There's so much that needs to play out in that conference. There's a lot of, they got 4 teams in this top 10, but there's just so much to sort out. Newberry's got a really tough schedule. That's got to sort itself out as well. So there's just so much to play out. I just want to mention, I think the most glaring thing out of everything that I have noticed so far is the Gulf South only really having 2 teams. And right behind them, the CIAA only has 1. Fayetteville State's strength of schedule is just so weak with the CIAA South. There's just a number of even 2-loss teams here that are looming outside of this top 10 that I if I were a betting man, this is going to look vastly different even next week.
Oh yeah.
So that's really some of the biggest differences between Super Region 1 and Super Region 2.
Yeah, there's definitely been years where half of this page was Gulf South Conference throughout almost the entire rankings process, and that's just not really the case this year. I do also want to mention, Ferg might have touched on it, and I apologize if I missed it, but someone had mentioned in the chat that Delta State is 8-0. They are 8-0 overall. Only games against Division II competition are counted in this rankings process. So for this exercise, Delta State is 7-0. That victory over Mississippi Valley does not count in the regional rankings. Any non-D2 game, whether it's an FCS, D3, NAIA, club team, are not counted.
And exactly as Chuck said, that's something to kind of follow along with the whole deal across the board, whether you play an NAIA or a D3 or what have you.
Right.
Ferg, when I first pulled up because I took a look at each page this morning in terms of what we're going to have here. You obviously, cover HBCU stuff for us. I can't recall the last time I saw this many HBCU squads on this page. Did you come away with that same thought when you first pulled it up, Ferg?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that some of the really nice things that have happened in the HBCU world have really played out really nicely this go around. But also, there are other things that will, as they play out over the next 2 weeks, including the way that the South Atlantic has divided their divisions into divisions now, I think actually may work against them this year as teams continue to beat up on each other. But, Albany State having out-of-conference wins against Shorter and a Mississippi College team that, literally nobody wants to play, it has really helped here. Virginia Union's wins as well been very, very beneficial. And then, even a Fayetteville State, that's looming outside of this top 10, having a win against what is now a 500 USC Pembroke is looking quite nice. So, the HBCU conferences are sitting pretty good, even though the CIAA only has 1 team. It's really the SIAC that's carrying the weight there.
Well,
yeah. One other thing that I saw, Ferg, was West Florida seems like almost a bit of a swing team here, like a little bit of an asterisk next to them as to where they may land. Because, Chuck and I spoke earlier, and when I was taking a look at it myself, I could have had West Florida anywhere between 3 and 5, depending on how heavily I wanted to look at things like performance indicators or, obviously their SOS. Did you have some of that same trouble when you were looking kind of towards that upper portion of the page?
Yeah, West Florida is kind of interesting because they don't have as many wins, and you see that strength of schedule really jumps out of the page here. But they certainly don't have as many wins in Division Two for one, and that's a virtue of having difficulty finding Division Two opponents, I would say. Um, but I think the other part of that strength of schedule piece of that is look at who they have left to play. They've got West Alabama, Valdosta, and Mississippi College. And so I think that's going to kind of bring that strength of schedule down a little bit. And really at the end of the season, um, I think where they are, barring something catastrophic happening ahead of them, is probably right.
So if the other teams win in front of them, you're saying this may be their ceiling.
I think so.
Okay.
I really do think that this may be their ceiling.
And as we're talking about this, that brings up an important point, Ferg, because the first team on the list, guys, is going to get a bye. Then 2, 3, and 4 are all going to have a home game. And then 5, 6, and 7 all go on the road somewhere. And we're not really ready to jump into that whole piece yet. But so for them being on the 4 line would be kind of be big because they'd have a home game at that point.
Yeah, I think it's one other thing to kind of mention here is that this is a unique region in the fact that you have 2 conferences that only play 10 games. And so, Albany State, unless they find an 11th game, if they happen to get past Fort Valley, right, they're going to be on the outside looking in, and they're just going to be kind of sitting ducks and waiting to see if something happens in, let's say, the South Atlantic. That's a kind of a unique feature here that also has to be taken into account. So there's a chance that Albany State could be at a ceiling as well, even with one loss, because of that 10-game, the dreaded 10-game schedule that the HBCUs play.
Ferg, I know Lenore Ryan's listed as 9th by Inkblot in this. They would be the only 2-loss team on the page. Do you think Lenore Ryan's going to be a part of that 10 that come out tomorrow, or do you think they won't be?
I think that they will. I think that a lot of that has to do with the strength of schedule.
Yeah.
Playing into that, Lenore Ryan's basically in an elimination status, like elimination game. Like this upcoming week is a really big deal against Wingate. If they can't do it, they're done. So, whether they're in or not, it almost doesn't matter because the stakes are just so high for them in particular.
Ferg, I think that's where the SAC in Super Region 2 here is very similar to the Northern Sun in Super Region 4. There's multiple elimination games every week now going forward.
Right. I'd agree. Yep. Absolutely.
Same for the NCAA in Super Region 3.
Do we have any other questions or comments about Super Region 2?
No, I think it's just kind of what Ferg just touched on there is one of the reasons why, this is so much fun to dive into and dissect and discuss and debate. But, a lot of the stuff is ultimately going to get settled on the field. So, if Lenore Ryan's in there and you don't think that they should be, well, that'll get resolved next week. And if they don't belong there, Wingate's going to take care of that. And if they beat Wingate, then they're going to be in there. So these things will all still get settled on the field.
Yep. All right. So great job, Chris. Let's go ahead and bring up. Let's go ahead and bring up Super Region 3. There you go. And if the playoffs were to start next week, Grand Valley at 7-0 with a great strength of schedule would have a bye in the first round.
Yeah, they would, Brandon. And I think, what's interesting about Super Region 3, amongst many things, but one of the things that has the biggest impact on it is 2 of the 4 conferences do have the insular schedules. Mm-hmm. So those teams from those conferences, the MIAA and the GAC, are going to have that 500 strength of schedule math. And sometimes it's an advantage and sometimes it's not. And I think what you're going to see here in the weeks that follow is that as they work through the remainders of their schedules, I think there's the only real thing that's easy to predict here is that if Grand Valley and Ferris State win out, they're going to be either 1-2 or 1-3. And I would make the case they're probably going to end up 1-2 in this region just because their strength of schedule rankings are not going to slide. In fact, in a couple of spots, they might improve a little bit. And there's going to be such a delta between the insular scheduled teams that I think for Ferris, that one loss, they'll be able to overcome that because their strength of schedule is so high. And what's funny is we started looking into some of this math in preparation for this. Their strength of schedule number was actually even higher than what it is now. and Lenore Ryan and Central Washington getting beat over the weekend actually brought it down. So to think about where it would be if some of those teams had continued to win over the weekend, it would just be out of sight. So I think from there, you're going to see a fair amount of attrition, just from the standpoint that, when you see Davenport and Saginaw Valley, I mean, that's 4 GLIAC teams that are in this initial top 10. I don't think that's going to hold serve. I mean, Davenport has only 1 win thus far over a team with a winning record, and that is Truman, who did make the list. But their strength of schedule is going to go through the roof over the next 3 weeks, but they got to play the other 3 GLIAC teams that are in the rankings here. So you're either going to see them winnow their way out, or they might knock somebody off and hurt where they are. So there's that to look forward to. I think from there, again, if Washita and Pitt State, win out, their places are pretty secure. And then it's just, again, it's a battle of attrition from there. Indianapolis and Truman still have to play each other. Truman actually still has a couple of decent teams, in McHenry being one, left on their schedule. Emporia State still has to play Northwest. And there are 2 or 3 other instances, and Devin had alluded to it earlier within the MIAA, where a bunch of 2-loss teams still have to play each other. So things are, going to kind of work themselves out here towards the bottom end of the list. But again, the insular schedule just becomes such an important factor here, just because we see, again, Grand Valley, Ferris, Saginaw Valley with those sky-high strengths of schedule. They're going to have advantages over teams that have the same number of losses that they do when we get to November 13th.
Tony, let me ask, as I take a look at the very bottom of that grouping there, Saginaw Valley. If we take a look at 8, 9, 10, okay, and I mean in this, just as I see them on the left, Harding, Emporia State, and Saginaw.
Yep.
The SOS, strength of schedule, and the records are almost identical from those 3 there, okay? Then as I continue left to right, if all those things are almost equal, Saginaw has 1 less win over 500 and also has a lower performance indicator. So my initial thought was Saginaw Valley should be 10 as opposed to Inkblot having them 8. However, I'm gonna take a guess that Inkblot has Saginaw higher than what Harding and Emporia, because they've beaten Indianapolis, who's in the field in front of them. And I don't believe Harding or Emporia State has a win over that grouping there. Would that be kind of your take? Because I wasn't sure if I was going to jump that far myself, but I would have still had Saginaw in the top 10.
Yeah, and I again, I know Inc. tries to keep this as math-based as possible, and I don't know if there's any sort of forward-thinking component to that, because Harding and Emporia, their strength of schedules are going to drop. I mean, they're both going to fall down to roughly 500, because that's right. That's what how the math is going to work out. But I that's the only logical explanation that I can see that would make sense, is that they're getting maybe that extra credit for having beaten Indianapolis, last week. And again, to your point, Harding and Emporia don't have wins over anybody that make this list. And that can be a criteria that is used to kind of, break those sorts of ties when you see teams that have resumes or math that's as identical as those teams seem to have. That's kind of the impression that I get, is that's one of those criteria that would be used to pump somebody up over the other ones.
Sure.
Yeah, and Inkblot just said in the chat too, he's less confident about Saginaw Valley the more he looks at the numbers and stuff like that. So very interesting to see how it all kind of works out there. And as we said earlier, the big games in this region coming up next couple of weeks. This week we got Washita Baptist. They're still playing East Central, who's a 6-2 team, who's on the outside looking here. That's a huge game for them. They also have to play Henderson State at the end of the year. That's another huge game for them. I think Pitt State, they don't play any of the teams left with 2 losses, but playing at Central Oklahoma and versus Washburn, those aren't layup wins by any means. They could definitely fall in one of those games, and at that point, they're probably losing a home game in the playoffs if that happens. And it'll be interesting to see if they weigh the Ferris State strength of schedule versus Pitt State wins kind of deal in that 2-3 spot. I think that's something to look forward to in that one. And then the Emporia, Nebraska, Kearney, Northwest thing for the 3 teams in the NCAA that are still alive there, with Northwest playing both of them on the road to the next 3 weeks, with at Kearney this week and then at Emporia in the last week of the regular season. That could definitely make for something interesting, where if both Emporia and Kearney both win those games, at that point I think Emporia gets in over Kearney because they have the head-to-head over them. Kind of going back to we talked about in Super Region 1, the head-to-head would be huge there. So I think if you're Emporia State, you're rooting for Kearney to beat Northwest, and you guys beat Northwest as well, because that gives you another win over a 2-loss team as well. They're going to help out with that above 500. I know there's other factors. If Kearney can stay in that top 10, it'll help them in that category as well, with wins versus teams that are ranked kind of deal for the Comedians in Super Region 3, because they can't use SOS as much because of the 2 silo schedule conferences on there. So just a couple of things to kind of keep an eye out there for it. As you said before, Davenport plays the 3 teams in the GLIAC.
Yep.
So a lot still to work out with those teams. Harding, their strength of schedule is going to drop quite a bit. They have a couple of 3 and 5 teams and a 1-win team remaining as well. Looking at that, so I'm very intrigued to see how it's going to work out. But as someone said in the chat, it's more and more like the playoffs start now for a lot of these teams, or have already started a couple weeks ago. You have to win out, even have a chance to get in the playoffs.
I think the 2 teams that interest me the most on this board are actually Ouachita and Truman State. Ouachita, for the reason that they have been a very dominant football team so far in the GAC. They have a 2-game lead, I think, on the entire field, but they have a very difficult ending couple of weeks here of the season. Devin actually read through their schedule. You got East Central, Southeastern Oklahoma State, and Henderson State. Those are all winning football teams. You know, I would not be surprised if one of those teams gets Ouachita. So they've got a really tough close to the season. So I'm very interested in watching them. And Truman's,
if they win out with that schedule, that's 3 more wins above 500. Their schedule goes up. They might be in contention for that 2 seed too, especially if Pitt State loses or if something happens with Ferris State as well there. So they're not out of the running there for a top 2 seed as well if they handle their business.
Definitely not. Things could go in a couple of different directions for Ouachita with what they have left ahead of them. And Truman State is a team that we've talked about very little throughout the season on this show. We've hardly mentioned them, but they've won 6 in a row. And they kind of have the same thing as Ouachita does in the GLVC. You know, when you look at what's left for them, Quincy, it's not a great football team, but they've been playing some pretty good football lately. McKendree, and then they close the season with Indianapolis. So, you know, those are the 2 teams that I think are probably the most interesting to me, just because obviously we've got eyes on Grand Valley and Ferris and Pittsburgh State all year. We've been talking about them and seeing everything that they're doing. Ouachita and Truman, 2 teams that are probably in the race here that have some big games ahead.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to mention, guys, is we've talked about our top 25 results earlier in the show. If I'm not mistaken, I think the only 2 teams that are currently in the top 25 that are not in a top 10 in the regional rankings are Kearney and Northwest. Nebraska, Kearney, and Northwest are both in the MIAA. We kind of talked about how this, at some point in time, we may see the MIAA kind of bitten in the butt by this whole silo scheduling. And right now we're on track for that time to be this year and right now. So Northwest is 14th right now on the list. If you were to kind of look further down, per the resume, they're the least impressive 2-loss team in the whole mix, just because of how their schedule has been up to this point. If a team like Northwest wins out, who's got Northwest has been to the playoffs for how many consecutive years, Brandon?
Since 2004 to last year.
Right. So, I mean, that's a long, long streak. And, they're going to have to win out, and they're going to need some help. So, I mean, I mentioned them just because of that streak and how they've been the best team in recent D2 football history.
Yep.
Well, and that's a good way to put a bow on this there too, Whit, because that was one of the things I wanted to make sure we talked about was a team with a 15, 16, 17-year playoff streak is not even on the first, list of potential bracket makers. And so that is so glaring an omission. But again, it's not an omission. That's their play on the field hasn't warranted them making this list. But I think that's how much things, and that's probably even a good side comment to make for everybody watching, is that's indicative of how much this is going to shift over the next 3 weeks. This list it has the potential to look blindingly different, not only in 3 weeks from now, but from week to week at every step along the way. And so when you look at, Northwest, who still has Kearney, they still have Missouri Southern, who, if they win one of their last 3 games, could be another 500-plus opponent. And then at Emporia, hey, with what Northwest has left, if they win out, I don't know that they need as much help as you think, Whit. I think there's a good chance that all of a sudden that starts to change their resume so significantly that they're definitely going to make the top 10. Whether they whittle their way onto the 7 or the 6 line or not, I suppose, is another topic. But they're going to suddenly become a 2-loss team that has a pretty good case to make.
Sure.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of bounce off that to end this conversation a little bit. You're looking at Grand Valley and Ferris are pretty much locks, most likely here that we're looking at there. Pitt State and Ouachita. So at that point, you have 4 teams. The winner of UND and Truman will be in Barrington. That's 5 teams. That's only 2 spots available left for either a 2-loss MIAA team, Saginaw Valley, or a 2-loss GAC team on there. So you got 3 teams pretty much kind of vying for 2 spots, 3 or 4 teams vying for 2 spots. And at that point, it's what the committee kind of prefers, everything like that. So, and I think if Henderson State or East Central, if they both win out, if Henderson State beats Ouachita the last week of the regular season, that's the worst possible news if you're an MIAA team, because that could possibly limit a spot for you on there. So,
every year we come up with these incredible scenarios where crazy stuff is going to happen, and then they never happen.
It's usually something crazier that happens.
So, all right. Does anybody else have any other comments about Super Region 3? Can we move on to 4? All right. Let's go ahead and do that.
I'm done.
All right. Let's All right, if the playoffs were to start this week, Angelo State deservedly would have the bye as the only undefeated team in Super Region 4. What are your thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, I think they're about as clear-cut a favorite as we can get with this.
Yeah.
When I took a look at this, Brandon, I kind of broke this down into a few segments. Clearly, Angelo State is the top team in the mix here. You take a look at not only the only unbeaten team, their strength of schedule sky high, all that stuff. Then it gets interesting right away with 2, 3, and 4. And, Chuck and I chatted earlier in the day. And he and I didn't have this the exact same way, and I'm not sure either one of us is right or wrong, to be honest. If you take a look right here, you've got Kingsville, and I want you to have a look at Kingsville and Sioux Falls specifically.
Okay.
Because if you take a look, Kingsville's basically, kind of composite record plus SOS is about 50 points higher than Sioux Falls.
Mm-hmm.
They're both 500 or better at 2-1. The performance indicator is essentially, about the same. But when you drill down to it with Sioux Falls, they've won 2 more games.
Right.
So it becomes one of those. How is 7-1 in the Northern Sun with all of these teams here that are currently on the page compare with how Kingsville is at 5-1? And, when you look at the Lone Star teams, it's basically, West Texas at the very bottom of the page, and otherwise Angelo, who they got blasted by yesterday. So Sioux Falls has beaten Augustana right below them. So you start to wonder how much of some of these other factors going to come into play, or if it's strictly by the numbers. I think you have Kingsville probably on the 2 line tomorrow, even though it'll be all alphabetized.
Mm-hmm.
And, Chuck and I kind of went back and forth on this a little bit, because if you move more the direction of the eyeball test and things that would influence that, it's probably more Sioux Falls. Now, before I move ahead with the rest of the list, Chuck, was that kind of a fair take that from kind of what we chatted about earlier today?
I think so. And I guess high level, what I expect to happen in this region, or what I think would happen if they were stack ranking 1 to 10, is you'd have a pretty clear picture of your undefeated team, then your 1-loss teams, and then your 2-loss teams. And within each of those groups, they'd stack rank them by strength of schedule. But that Kingsville and Sioux Falls scenario is very interesting, because you've got a 7-1 record against a 5-1 record. If Kingsville is 6-1 or 7-1, this isn't even a discussion, because there's such a huge disparity in strength of schedule. Kingsville gets the spot, no doubt.
Yeah,
and this kind of goes back to a point we made earlier. Kingsville actually is 7-1, but they have 2 non-countable games. So against D2 competition, they're 5-1. So that actually does make a better winning percentage argument for Sioux Falls. Now, would the committee look at it that way? The way I'm kind of looking at it and saying 7-1's better than 5-1, and Sioux Falls gets the spot? Or are they going to say, look at the strength of schedule difference, Kingsville goes second, and Sioux Falls comes in line after them? We don't really know. We can only discuss and debate.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was looking at Kingsville being on the 2 line. I know Chuck and Inc. were thinking Sioux Falls, Sioux Falls would be on the 2 line. Either way, we're going to have all kinds of time for these teams to sort this out because they're so close right there. But then you move into the 2 loss squads, and Colorado Mines is kind of a fire-breathing dragon of the 2 loss squads. I mean, you take a look at them with the 590 SOS and so forth. They're clearly going to be the 4 in that grouping. Matter of fact, they're not very far behind Sioux Falls with 1 loss. If you really look at them head to head, then you get into this whole mess of 2 loss squads in the Northern Sun, and you've got Augustana, as you can see there, Winona State, you got Minnesota State Mankato, you got Wayne State, and you got Bemidji, all in a line there. And Chuck and I basically took a look at it and said, you know what? All those 500 or better numbers are pretty similar. You've got teams that are going to have tiebreakers up and down that thing. They're going to conflict each other.
Right.
It's
really head-to-head, right? Because if you look at that group of 6-2 teams in the NSIC, there is a ton of head-to-head results involving all those teams. And the point that you and Tony and I were talking about earlier, it's a big factor where it can be applied. But you can't look at that group, just that group, and apply head-to-head as a differentiator because you'd have too many conflicting results.
Yeah, and the good thing is, obviously, Chuck, is that number of 2 loss teams in the Northern Sun is going to be cut in half in short order here.
Right.
You got 2 games this week that are almost pseudo-elimination games in that regard. But so as we looked at it, Chuck and I both independently came to the same conclusion that of those 2 loss teams in the Northern Sun, Augustana would be the highest of them at the 5 line. And then you would kind of just go straight down the page from there in regards to their strength of schedule. Now, I realize, for example, we've got Minnesota State Mankato could be as high as maybe the 6th line because of the fact that they have better results than most of that group against 500 or better teams. But then you can also start to get into all these head-to-head things where they lost to Wayne State, who's directly below them, but they beat Bemidji State, who's below them. And I mean, you can go back and forth all over the place with that, and it gets a little wild. So for the time being, we're going to say that those teams are going to be 5 through 9 in some order, probably looking similar to that. And then kind of the surprise of the mix is West Texas sitting at 10. I watched the West Texas football game last night. I didn't get any impression from their announcers or anybody else that they had any thoughts that they were going to be a part of this conversation. I really didn't. They were kind of talking about finishing the year strong and things like that. Almost kind of like, yeah, we know we didn't play real good in the beginning half, but let's finish strong. They're very much in the conversation here with their win yesterday over Central Washington. And all of a sudden, with the South Division of the NSIC beating up on each other, they're going to just move up by continuing to win football games. And if you take a look, West Texas does not have a game that they should lose upcoming, so they should win out. Bemidji State also should win out, and everybody up above there has got a whole lot of games against each other.
Yeah, and I think that West Texas SOS is going to stay pretty strong too.
Yeah, I mean, they'll drop a little, but that's the thing, though, Chuck, is other than Augustana on this page with 2 losses, none of the other Northern Sun teams have a real formidable strength of schedule number to deal with them if they're on the 3 loss line with them. So this is probably be the wildest super region of the 4, just because of all the games that remain in that grouping right there.
Without a doubt.
All right.
Any chance Northern State gets in the discussion as well for the Northern Sun?
Northern State still has Bemidji left. Northern State's got 3 losses. If I take a look down the page, they're at 457 for SOS. In order for them to move up into that 3-loss conversation, they would need to have an SOS that's going to be over 500, in my opinion, and I don't see how they get there with what they have left. They would almost need to have, Devin, some go-get-'em games, like a game against like a Sioux Falls or an Augie or somebody, another high-profile one that they could get. I mean, we're not saying it's beyond the realm of possibility because they snuck up last year late and had a chance, but just didn't, finish out because they have both Bemidji and Duluth left. And Duluth has now got 3 losses and not a great strength of schedule by their loss to Bemidji just this last game. And I think that was an elimination game essentially.
Gotcha.
Okay. Any other comments, questions about Super Region 4? All right.
Chaos.
Okay. It always
That's
is. And
gonna be fun.
I said, we always come up with scenarios and go over them, and then they seldom seem to happen.
Well, like I said, a lot of this stuff ultimately does get resolved on the field.
It does.
We're debating how things stand today, but a lot of this will get resolved once the games are played.